Hello, everyone. So, as I moved through elementary and middle school and high school, I quickly realized that a lot of my experience was based on the idea of the right and the wrong answer. And I find this upsetting for a lot of reasons, which I'll go into. What do we know about youth? Well, they learn. And even if they're as stubborn as I am, they will eventually learn right and wrong. When we get into a classroom, we see the dynamic between students and teachers. And we're supposed to have a dialogue, where the student is engaging the teacher and vice versa. The student is responding to what the teacher's saying, and the teacher is giving the student a dialogue. They're giving them information, and the student should be responding. But in reality, we get something more like this, because the teacher is giving them information, not a dialogue. The teacher is telling them what they need to know, and the student is supposed to at some point respond, but they're supposed to respond along the guidelines of question and answer. Well, what does this eventually mean? This means that rather than a student saying what they think and why, rather than actually going through the process of critical thinking, a student is simply responding to the material that they get. They're coming to school every single day, and their objective is to answer the right way. And very often, students run into the wrong way before they get to the right way. Similarly, even when it comes to critical thinking, when they're given that opportunity to, analyze material, it's still in the format of things like multiple choice. Like when a student gets a critical reading section and somehow they've critically thought incorrectly and they've chosen answer B instead of answer A. When they are given the chance then to speak and perhaps engage students or engage their teacher, it's in the format of things like a book report. And when they present a book report, they're not presenting what they think, they're re-articulating someone else's thoughts. They're re-articulating a book. They're re-articulating ideas or a plot. And they're engaging the students the same way that they see the teacher engage them, which is talking at them. They're not exchanging ideas, they're not responding to their peers. And we move through most of elementary school and middle school doing this, and when we do get to high school, we are given the opportunity to discuss. And a common complaint I hear from teachers is that they can't get the ball rolling. Students don't want to say anything, they're reluctant to. Students are reluctant to because they don't know if it's the answer the teacher wants. So in response to this, some teachers try to moderate the discussion, but what ends up happening is they pose a question, the students don't answer, eventually one does, and then the teacher kind of translates what they've said, or they simplify it, or they respond to it. And the student's no longer talking to the other students, they're talking to the teacher, and then the teacher poses a new question based on that student's response. So rather than engaging one another, students are constantly engaging the teacher, and they're coming to school and they're just trying to respond to material. So what else do we know about youth? Youth hear. And in fact, nowadays, we hear a lot. We hear more than ever. We hear things from our parents, we hear things from our schools, we hear things from institutions. And they're always along the guidelines of right and wrong. What you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing, perhaps what you should think, what you shouldn't think. Morality, politics, everything. We hear all of it. And eventually it becomes noise. Because when you're hearing all these conflicting ideas about right and wrong, what are you supposed to do with it? And this is more prevalent than ever, of course, in our politics. Students constantly hear different things, and whether or not they're actually involved in the nitty-gritty of politics, whether or not they're actually aware of all that's going on, they know the big issues like abortion or gay rights, they know about immigration, and it's likely that they might have something to say whether or not they're going to tell you. They'll hear Fox News versus MSNBC. They hear Republicans versus Democrats. And the thing is, a lot of people don't actually identify with these extremes, so they don't know where they fall. And when youth have been taught this idea of right and wrong, what happens when they don't identify with either set of right or wrong? And even though moderate is kind of a rare species at the moment, more people find themselves in the middle or unsure of where they stand rather than along one of these guidelines. Similarly, youth also see a lot of extreme movements. They see the Tea Party, and they see the Occupy Wall Street movement. And it's difficult for youth to develop an opinion on any of these topics when they're not really sure what they think, and they're not sure if it's the right answer. So what do they do once they've heard? They choose. I found that most students don't. In fact, most of the discussions that end up, with kids sitting there silent at their desks reflect this. Similarly, my experiences being involved in civic engagement programs, political programs, showed me that a lot of students don't choose. And to backtrack a bit, my story is that eventually those schools where the teachers pretty much kept telling me to shut my mouth, I did leave. Except I left with a different sense of self. I left with this idea that in order to be a good student, I had to commit myself to the right and wrong. If I played by the book, I'd get an A, and I'd go to some extremely fantastic institution. I was miserable, absolutely miserable. I went to school every day. It was the equivalent of an 8:30 to 5 job because I always did activities after school. And I took the material, I responded, I raised my hand a lot, according to the answers that I knew I had to give. And I hated it. And then I became involved with a program called Model UN. And I went there functioning as the same person. I came with all my materials. I came ready to give the right answers, but kind of terrified to speak because I'd stopped speaking according to what I thought and more according to what I thought I was supposed to think. So when I get to this conference, it ended up being these 3 absolutely life-changing days. And the first day, I was shaking. I stood up, but more because I like a challenge than because I had anything to say. For the first 4 hours of committee, I didn't know what to do. And then eventually, I did stand up, and I spoke on behalf of the United Kingdom. And rather than addressing my peers, I almost treated it as though it was a classroom situation, and I addressed the person at the front of the room, who was the chair. So I wasn't too proud of myself. And the day keeps going on, and we're now into day 2. And finally, someone says something that just made me tick, like in my gut. Like I just knew. I was like, I don't think that's right. Especially I was like, according to my documents, this can't be right. So I finally raised my name card, my placard, and I stood up. And rather than addressing the chair, even though I formally had to do so, I addressed the students around me. And when I addressed the students around me, everything kind of came to life. Because all of a sudden, I was engaging people around me. I was having a discussion, and someone responded to me, and someone responded to the previous delegate who had spoken. And it was amazing, because I was having a discussion about an issue, and I hadn't had the chance to actually feel like I was sharing my voice for the longest time. And I left this weekend feeling really empowered, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I went back to school and hated it. Later that spring, I became involved with another program called Youth in Government, which simulates state government, and students prepare bills, and they go in and they debate them. They get into committees, they rank, etc., and slowly bills move upward and upward into chambers, like the House and Senate. And when I got there, the same process occurred. I didn't really know what I was doing, even though I now thought I had some experience with public speaking. And I wasn't sure what to say. But eventually, I got the nerve, something clicked, and I began, once again, engaging the students around me and being engaged by them, being challenged by them, having my opinion responded to, as opposed to just nodded at and saying, okay, that's very valid, let's move on to the next student. Someone was always responding to what someone else was saying. And it was extremely amazing and, again, empowering to be part of a dialogue when I'd basically spent most of my freshman year sitting in a corner with my book and my homework. So at the end of this conference, even though I was a freshman, I ran for a position. And when I ran for a position, I found that I was now supposed to engage students the way that I had been engaged. And I found that this was very difficult. But nonetheless, I found that when I gave students the tools, when I told them that it's not about being wrong or being right, that when it wasn't about whether or not their opinion was valid enough or was good enough, that when they engaged one another, this collective synergy kind of came out. It was no longer 1 + 1 = 2. It was that 1 + 1 equals the fact that they made a decision. It was something greater than whether or not they passed that bill, greater than whether or not they passed a resolution. And it created something entirely new. And I would lead these committees seeing kids who hadn't spoken at all getting up and standing and speaking and enjoying themselves and being really proud. And to me, that is how you engage youth. And that was what I realized through these programs, that the way to engage youth is through discussion, discourse, and debate. And I differentiate between these 3 because discussion is getting kids to talk about finding a solution. Discourse is making it a bit more formal, teaching them that there can be formats that kind of enforce respect, that you have to respond to another delegate in an appropriate manner, so that even when you're on fire, don't burn the other kids around you. And finally, debate, the active exchange and challenge of ideas. And when you can get students to do all 3 of these things, you've engaged them in a way that they're not engaged in school. That's why I believe in don't see the process, be the process. You can tell kids to do things. You can tell them to investigate a problem. You can tell them to do as much as possible and try to find ways to solve things, but you're telling them also just kind of go out and learn and go out and watch. and they're going to find politics, and they're going to find a mess, and they're going to find a whole lot of right and wrong. But if they're part of the process, they realize that right and wrong isn't the only solution, that there's a whole lot of in between. And that applies to both life and to politics and the decisions that they're going to make. So if you want youth who are going to be active and who are going to engage themselves in their communities, youth who are going to vote, youth who are going to become your teachers and your leaders and your parents, you need to make them part of the process so they realize that they have a voice. And they realize that whether or not they know enough or they think they know enough to be involved and to engage the people around them and to change the nature of discussion as they see it. Thank you.